You're listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How's it going?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
Good. Can I use the same joke that I used in the previous episode? How do you like my backdrop? How do you like my expensive books and bookshelf?
It looks so real. So many fine leather-bound items, as our friend Ron Burgundy would say.
You'd be shocked to know that it's actually a green screen, that I haven't put in a $50,000 library in my home.
Yeah, it's a nice looking library, that's for sure. Not now your sad, pathetic life of having to like get up from the green screen and look around where you're at. Because I know where you record is like, I like you, Jim, but I know that that's not the area.
Yeah, exactly. Well, maybe someday. I mean, the podcast is getting pretty popular. The topic that I wanted to bring up is, and this will be, stealing from my predictions down the road, but I could see us being a top 10 podcast in the world. And we're not just talking about IAM, which, that would be pretty impressive in and of itself. But what is the statistic for top 10 podcasts, top 10%? I should make that clear, right? We're not going to be a top 10 podcast in the world, top 10%.
Yeah. So, I've actually meant to bring this up on previous episodes, but we've been doing really well, surprisingly, I think shockingly so. Currently, if you consider all the podcasts globally, and there's like some 90 million episodes or something like that that are out there, we are actually somewhere between the top 25 and like 10% or 15% of all podcasts in the world, like globally, not just identity, everything, which is fantastic. And certainly, I'm gonna nominate everyone who's listening as listener of the week for being part of that journey as we, started this off a little over 2 years ago. And it's like, I was just Jim and I listening to it, but we've certainly grown. But yeah, it's pretty cool. I think this is an area that is ripe for disruption. So if you're listening and you have like a product that does a good job of accurately, and this is the key word, accurately getting podcast statistics for listenership across every single service that's out there, because that's the challenge. I would certainly be interested in hearing, because there are certainly products in the space that do it, but it seems to me that accuracy is a little bit of a question mark, because if you think about I know most of our listeners, for example, are listening on Apple. That just happens to be our most popular platform based on the stats that I see. But they're a podcast, host and vendor is of their own. So of course they want to, keep sales information just like any other type of ad information to themselves. They may or may not make some pieces available to our podcast host, for example. Spotify's another one, Google's another, Amazon. And it seems like there's a whole bunch of these other, different aggregators that are out there. But yeah, based on the stats that I can see, we're in the, I would say somewhere in the top 15-ish% of all podcasts worldwide, which is crazy, absolutely crazy.
I think so too. The thing I'd throw out there as a challenge to all of our listeners is, if you would prefer to have this be a video podcast, can't guarantee that it'll happen, but let us know, because we're going to start doing the live streaming. We have video cameras. We potentially could do it. It's a lot more work. And honestly, if after you watch a few live streams, you might change your vote. But, let us know, because I think it's something we've been debating whether or not people actually would want that.
It is a lot more work, that is for sure. Audio is relatively easy at this point for me to edit and host all that. So now we're getting to the big guns. But yeah, the live streaming stuff will be interesting. I think we'll start there.
The last thing I just wanted to mention is, I think this is our last episode for the year, right? So we will be back in 2022. And so we're just going to take a couple weeks off, try to spend some time with the fam and do all that good stuff. Last year we intended to do the same thing, and then the SolarWinds supply chain hack took place, and we did a special episode. So something like that could happen again, but at this point we're planning on taking a few weeks off.
Yeah, you were the madman recording it like Christmas Eve or something like that. And I was like, all right, I'll edit it, but I'm not getting on. Like, I'm on vacation, dude. Yeah, last one for a few weeks, but we are planning to continue the live stream through the break here. So relatively new for us. We're still kind of experimenting with it, but it's a live stream on YouTube. Follow us on Twitter at IDAC Podcasts. That's kind of where I'll announce when we're going live. If you go to idac.live, that'll take you right to our YouTube channel as well. Yeah, hopefully people kind of check it out. It's an opportunity to interact too, so you can kind of take comments. And the idea there is spend like 15 minutes, right? Something super easy for Jim and I to get on, be a little more current with some of the topics that maybe that are going on in the world, but also if there's things that pop up during the week, we can kind of address it kind of as a quick hitter. So the key is light and breezy, nice and easy, something along those lines. Right now, we'll try to do it on Friday mornings, I think, but we may have to flex it maybe to other days of the week, depending on kind of our schedule. So that's sort of the plan as we kind of move forward. But why don't we get into our main topic for today? Since we want to end on a high note, we're going to talk about fraud reduction platforms. And to help us with that conversation is a repeat guest we just had on just a few episodes ago. On episode 124, we talked with John Tolbert, lead analyst and managing director at KuppingerCole. Welcome back to the show, John.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, so thank you so much for coming back. And I think this is an area that really kind of dovetails really well with our previous conversation around consumer or customer IAM, CIAM. This is a capability, I think, that kind of resides in that area of, how do we make sure that now that we are managing our customers, right, that those identities are maybe not doing things they shouldn't be doing. So why don't we kind of break it down for the folks who are listening and might not be as familiar with this space as we get into it. And let's start with, what is a fraud reduction platform?
Fraud reduction intelligence platform, I think of as a service that sort of aggregates lots of different bits of intelligence about the consumer, retail, finance, lots of different industries, and helps those subscribing customers to reduce the amount of fraud that they have to deal with. And again, this cuts across many different industries. We probably think most commonly about finance, but retail, healthcare, travel and hospitality. Fraud has been on the increase year over year, and the last 18 months or so with COVID, we saw new forms of fraud, being generated. Fraud reduction intelligence platforms help businesses kind of stay ahead of that and reduce those unwanted fraudulent transactions.
We had a conversation last week with Armin from Ping around identity proofing. And I know that's one of kind of the major areas, so I think that's kind of included. But are there other areas of fraud reduction that are kind of seen as like a core competency or capability?
Yeah, I call out 6 major capabilities, and yep, identity proofing is definitely one of the really important ones there. It's good in many cases to be able to tie the right individual to a digital account. And depending on regulations and the type of transaction it is, that's actually required to be able to do that. So identity proofing is a very important fraud reduction technique. But then we also have things like compromised credential intelligence, knowing where maybe a credential has been misused recently. That can be a factor that can help, throw an alarm. Then we have things like user behavioral analysis, device intelligence, behavioral biometrics, and bot detection and bot management. Those are the 6 major areas of fraud reduction intelligence.
What are some of the threats that I guess these kind of platforms try to solve? I know we tend to see, themes, I think, from a cycle of where the attacks are coming from and what they're trying to look at. Obviously, ransomware is kind of a big one right now. But when it comes to, the fraud reduction side of things, what are some of the common threats that are out there?
I think the one that, most industries are worried about are account takeover. And it is exactly what it sounds like, taking over somebody's account. Often, unfortunately, it's too easy to do that because there's still password-based authentication out there. Or, in some cases, maybe Those passwords are backed up by knowledge-based authentication, security questions, asking, mother's maiden name, what high school did you go to, or something like that. All that information's publicly available if a fraudster wants to search for it. So unfortunately, it's in those cases where you're using password authentication backed up by KBA, then it's all too easy to take over accounts. So that's another reason why we recommend heartily multi-factor authentication wherever we possibly can. But yeah, account takeover, I'd say, is a number one concern globally. And then there's also new account fraud. Sometimes you'll call it account opening fraud or synthetic fraud. And that one's a little bit different. That's where you take bits and pieces of PII, personal information, and try to use that to assemble an account. And fraudsters do that, again, for financial reasons. They're trying to build accounts to, be mule accounts, move money around here, there, and everywhere, and information that, might be obtainable from healthcare records or education records, names, address, date of birth, other pieces of information, just how you go about building a digital account normally can be pieced together by fraudsters to create an account that then resembles a real person, but it's not the real person. And they're going to most likely use it for some sort of illegal activity. So I'd say those are the top two. There are also things like SIM swap attacks, getting a mobile operator to sort of reassign where a number rings to. And this is one of the, or where texts go. This is one of the reasons, like SMS, OTP, one-time passwords, getting a text on your phone to get you into a site can be problematic, because if there's a SIM swap on one end of the channel, then the fraudster can then direct those password reset requests or authentication requests to a device that they control. So that's closely related, but different means to get there.
I think that use case that you brought up there, John, with the account opening, that's the one that I've kind of become most familiar with in the fraud reduction. I think it's interesting to call it fraud reduction rather than fraud prevention, right? It's kind of acknowledging that even with these solutions, you're not preventing fraud. You're just making it more difficult for the fraudster to do their dirty deeds. But kind of back to that account opening, to me, that's when you talked about the PII, it's to give a real world example, it's when you go into an application, they say, okay, which of these four streets have you ever lived on, right? And they'll list 4 streets, and it's just that one that jumps out. You're like, oh yeah, I lived there 20 years ago, or I lived there when I was a teenager, or something like that. And you select, which one of these cars have you ever owned? And you're like, wow, how does this thing know so much about me? Well, the big major credit agencies know that data about you. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't those some of the biggest players in this space?
Yeah, both globally and especially in the US, credit rating agencies have a lot of information about all the consumers. So, much of that information is authoritative. A lot of name, address, pairs, all that information is available from places like that. But then, there's also different kinds of sources, like, local government agencies, DMVs, different types of licenses that have been issued, taxes. There's information that can be used to construct those accounts outside of credit rating agencies too.
Right. Yeah, it seems that there's a whole business model around aggregating that data, and then there's a business model around who builds the best mousetrap to use that data to create a fraud reduction. I almost said fraud reduction platform. Usually where I see this, so we split our time on the podcast talking about um, enterprise identity management, how things are used to manage your workforce, and customer identity management. When I think of fraud reduction, my mind usually goes to the consumer customer IAM platform. Is that generally the rule, or are there also some enterprise use cases that benefit from the fraud reduction?
Yeah, I think you're right. Most immediately, we think of how this can benefit consumers and consumer-facing organizations. But, a lot of the mechanics of how this is done can be used behind the scenes just the same way for enterprise authentication. So, we want not only to see enterprises using multi-factor authentication to protect their assets, but also risk-based authentication. So a lot of the same types of risk engines that can evaluate bits and pieces of information about consumers at transaction time can also be used to look at how an employee logging in from a different location, give it a risk score. So, technology behind that can be very similar. It comes down to, what are the information sources? How do you prioritize those factors in policies? And then what do you want to do with them?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I've always kind of wondered or thought about, like, wow, you could really use this kind of um, identity verification in so many ways, including enterprise use cases. But what I've kind of heard um, is that it's very expensive to use this fraud reduction methodology to kind of use just to pick on one of the big players in the space, Experian, to use an Experian application to ask these questions. It's not pennies; it's more than that. And obviously, when you're talking about opening a bank account or opening an account to trade cryptocurrency or something like that, it's uber important to verify that identity, um, versus other scenarios where, in like a retail environment, as long as you're able to provide some level of verification, it's good enough.
Well, I think, again, kind of unfortunately with the rise of COVID, we've seen some interesting technology applications, though, of let's call it fraud reduction technology, the identity proofing piece, especially for onboarding new employees. So, again, there are certain pieces of information you need to put together depending on, what jurisdiction you're in order to onboard an employee. So, these remote identity proofing apps have become quite popular in the last year and a half or so. And I think that's only going to continue to gain in popularity. And that's a direct application of a type of fraud reduction technology for an enterprise use case.
I think we're going to see more use cases come out of this, because I think of the current pandemic situation and vaccine cards, right? So I think a lot of organizations are trying to figure out how do they comply with maybe local orders on vaccination status for employees, federal contractors, for example, in the US, whatever government mandates are kind of out there when it comes to that, is how do you securely gather that data rather than just say, oh, I'm just going to put it on our company SharePoint site, right? I don't think that's probably the way to go with it. So I'm seeing, organizations take this third party approach to try and gather that information. So I'm wondering if fraud reduction platforms also play in the role in the secure collection of some of this data to kind of facilitate that in a way that maybe people are more comfortable, at least on the enterprise side. I'm wondering, and this is kind of an open question, right? I think I'm just curious if you see it like that, John, or if there's other ways that maybe I should be thinking about as well.
I think that's an interesting possibility. I have not. I don't have any answers right now about is this something that's actively going on, in a commercially available product for, especially, in our locale. But it does seem like if there were authoritative sources of information about vaccination status, then yeah, that would be something that could be built in. I'm surprised that there hasn't been a bit more uptake on solutions like that. Same thing with decentralized identity, blockchain based identity for these kinds of COVID related use cases.
Yeah, give it 20 minutes. I think as fast as tech moves, somebody's probably building an app for that, right? Or they're re-engineering business process on their existing app to kind of account for that use case. Speaking of use cases, what are some of the key use cases that really these products are trying to solve? Because I know it's really the collection of the data, right? To kind of validate, okay, this is Jeff and he is who he says he is. And I think of the typical use case of onboarding a new employee. I need to show some sort of documentation that I, allowed to work, whether it's an ID or some sort of government thing, whatever it might be, at least in the US. What are some of the, other use cases that this sort of helps with?
Well, again, looking at those types of fraud, there's a lot of different variations in account takeover fraud, for example. So there's, probably rarely one-off attacks on people's accounts these days. We often hear about credential stuffing attacks using information from, perhaps the dark web, combinations of usernames and passwords to go out and sort of spray that against a bunch of different sites, see if people have reused passwords between sites. And then, if they have, you can take those accounts over if you've got the current password for it. So some of these more high assurance kind of use cases, I think that we've been hinting at, with like employment verification and, the need to concretely identify where a person has lived over the years. There are also, lower assurance kinds of use cases that, maybe certain kinds of businesses in retail, they don't necessarily need that rich history or, really strongly assured identity for, purchasing certain kinds of goods online or buying food at a grocery store. So you don't need that, but you do want to be assured that, this isn't a fraudulent transaction, especially if it's a, card not present kind of online transaction. So yeah, there's lots of different applications to this, and that's why I think we see many different approaches in fraud reduction, because there's the identity proofing, but now we see lots and lots more use of like behavioral biometrics. So for a retail use case, just having an assurance that the person who's using the device is the same person that registered, in many cases, that's enough to lower the risk significantly enough to allow transactions to go through. So those are some of the advantages things like behavioral biometrics could bring to fraud reduction.
John, I'm going to get up on my soapbox here. You talked a little bit about when you're going over the 6 areas of fraud reduction. One of the areas that I think you mentioned, and I want to verify that I got this right, is knowing when an account has been compromised elsewhere, right? So this is something that I've seen, and I'm going to just call out. I think Microsoft was saying, look, across our Office 365 or Azure environment, plus Microsoft Live, plus, all these different, plus Hotmail, we've got all these logins, billions of logins per day. We know which accounts potentially have been compromised. Plus, we're in a consortium with Facebook and Google, who, by the way, don't compete on the access management side of the house. To me, it's kind of like, they're using that security as a business differentiator, which, concerns me a little bit, right? Because I feel like that's something that potentially puts them in a anti-competitive position. I don't know if that's something you can talk about, but I wanted to throw it out there.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't comment too much on that other than to say, yeah, there's an advantage in having lots of login and transaction information to review. I think there are definite patterns that can be detected, and the more information you have, potentially, the more accurate you can be with those predictions. And there does seem to be, in some cases, silos of information where a particular vendor in this space, they can aggregate information about what they see across all their customers, but if there aren't information sharing mechanisms in place between vendors, then that could tend to limit the amount of transaction information available for analysis.
I think this is where we've seen a competitive advantage kind of break out, from a war between the top vendors in the authentication space. Microsoft talks about their signals that they get from across their Microsoft stack, right, of all the authentications they have. And I think at this point we're starting to see the beginnings of what might be called monopolistic behavior when it comes to authentication and logins. So this is purely my opinion, so please don't hold anyone else accountable. But I see things like Microsoft, Facebook, Google, and some of the big IDP players that are out there, right? Social logins, where they're collecting a lot of information from an authentication standpoint, but they're not necessarily sharing it. Google and Microsoft are not sharing their authentication signals with each other because I think that it's seen a little bit as a competitive advantage from the security they can provide for their users. And I know that certain governments are more tolerant of monopolistic behavior like that. At some point, does this type of data enter into that realm of, well, hold on a second, we need more interoperability, and if you don't do it voluntarily, we're going to kind of make you do it, which obviously opens up government and all the feelings that go around, big government, little government, what you say and say, can and can't do. But if the current trend continues where Microsoft, Google, and let's say login with Facebook continue to dominate login boxes around the world, at some point does it enter that state? Now, Apple has started to fight back a little bit with their not decentralized, but with their obfuscated user ID, but now they're collecting data as well, right? So they know what you're logging into. And I'm just curious, John, I won't put you on the spot, but it was something that it was just kind of occurring to me as we were kind of talking about this authentication strategy of this consolidation of user authentication information. At what point do we really need to open it up for the benefit of others, or do we leave it as a competitive advantage for these organizations to take advantage of and build better products on?
Well, I think I would say there is value in the compromised credential intelligence piece to this, but even so, there are other things that consumer-facing organizations would want to consider besides just that compromised credential intel. There's user behavioral analysis, and that's something that they could do potentially on their own or, through interaction with their fraud reduction intelligence platform vendor. Thinking about financial transactions, for example. Going beyond the login, it's good to know what the pattern of transactions has been for a user over a given month, 6 months, or a year, so that if suddenly there's a request to transfer $30,000 to someone there's no history of that in the user's behavioral profile, then that should, raise a red flag and stop that transaction until there's some other kind of implicit or explicit, authorization from the user. So, yes, login information is useful, but there are other things like UBA, the behavioral biometrics, device intelligence. Device intelligence, I think, is, when we think about strong authentication and needing, 2 out of 3 different kinds of factors, the device intelligence is in many cases just as important as others, because then you can find out IP reputation, device reputation, typical location history for a device. I think that's something that's just as important as all the other factors as well.
So we'll be back in person at conferences at some point. Anybody who wants to discuss this further over a beer, I would love to dive into this topic. But let's get back on track for a bit here, John. And I wanted to talk about kind of the approach. So evaluating the market, as a consumer or somebody who's representing an organization that has a need for a fraud reduction platform. I'm wondering, in your mind, 2 things. One is, what should I be looking for? And the second is, from the standpoint of who in that organization it should be, doing the shopping or brought to the table as the shopping is being performed. I think, when we talk about who's responsible for securing an organization, most people are going to point to the CIO or the CISO. They're not going to point to the business and say, you guys are responsible for securing the data. But this is one of those technologies that sort of blurs the line. And I feel like there needs to be participation from that business side in the selection of a fraud reduction platform, right? I'm just wondering, do you kind of share that perspective? And then again, the kind of the beginning of the question was, and kind of what should I be looking for to kind of help me decide which platform makes sense for me.
In a way, you're setting up to answer your own question. I think you need to know your business in order to know what to look for. So, yes, to a degree, CIO, CISO should probably be involved, but these are more business-driven kinds of decisions. So, let's say you're in retail or travel and hospitality, an industry like that. The business people probably have a better handle on the kinds of threats that may arise purely from the fraud side than, say, those who are charged with taking care of the infrastructure. Um, most of these are delivered as services, or almost all of them really are delivered as services. So this is something that you hook up to via API. This is a service that you call at runtime, fraud reduction intel service. So it's not something that necessarily needs to involve the security infrastructure directly. So I think of it more as a business decision, and having the business leaders involved in making those kinds of selections, I think, makes the most sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense because at the end of the day, right, the business, it's their data. And if I'm in the position of saying, okay, we need to have this capability, who's going to help me define what the rules are to even identify a pattern of fraud, right? The business is going to help me make that decision. So if I guess from my own personal perspective, it's like, okay, if I'm going to give a tool and someone's going to make me use a tool, I should at least hopefully have a say in what tool is being used. I think having that input would probably make a lot of sense. And I think of things now of other areas that this might stretch into, things like KYC or know your customer, or AML, anti-money laundering. Are these types of capabilities and services part of that fraud reduction platform? Or are those separate capabilities? How does that work?
That is built into many of the solutions. Many of the solutions that I reviewed this time around do have those kinds of capabilities for doing both KYC and AML. And in some cases, even more. The PEP compliance, politically exposed persons, OFAC lists, things like that can be checked for at registration time. So that those are, have a smaller audience maybe than some of the broader, lower assurance kinds of customers they may be dealing with, but it's extremely important that they comply with those regulations too. So, yes, to succinctly answer, AML, KYC is built into many of these solutions that are out there today.
Yeah, and this is an area that you did some recent reporting on, right? I think it was June of this year, 2021, that you had the leadership quadrant for the fraud reduction intelligence platform. So I'll have a link to that in our show notes so that people can check that out. Anything that you want to kind of tease people who might be interested?
Yeah, there's a lot of content. There's a lot of variety in the solutions that are out there. There's a base set of capabilities that needed to be in there. But I think going through it carefully. I mean, if you're in the market for this kind of a product, service, really, then yeah, look at the details. See who covers your industry, your particular technical requirements. And make decisions based on that.
So I think what we'll try to do now is pull us back up out of the heavy duty fraud conversation. And since this is the end of the year, we typically end a little bit on a lighter note. It would not be an end of year show of any sort if we didn't do some sort of predictions for 2022. So what I'd like to do is take us around the room, and we'll start with you, John, and then go to Jim. What are your identity predictions for 2022? And they can be good or bad, right? I'll leave it up to you if you want to be an optimist or a pessimist.
Well, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that we will probably still be entering passwords and answering security questions here and there.
That's a real stretch.
Well, okay. So on a more serious note, this identity proofing piece, I coming at this from both the fraud reduction side as well as the consumer identity side, I'm seeing much, much more interest in this, especially the different gradations of, how that might be included into transaction level analysis. I think in 2022, we're going to see a greater emphasis on identity proofing, even amongst different kinds of consumer-facing sites. I think that will avail itself as add-ons through a lot of the CIM solutions that are out there.
It sounds like a byproduct, right, of the pandemic and the less in-person, but still need to verify identities and validate statuses of maybe bits of pieces of information. So I'm on board with that. Jim, what about yourself from a prediction standpoint? What do you see for 2022?
Jeff, I'm typically a very optimistic person, but the thing I wanted to come through is some kind of prediction that wasn't just like, "Hey, I think more people are going to move to the cloud," because I think that one is kind of like John's. The password's still going to be around. I mean, here's what I'm worried about. I'm worried about continued escalation of not only ransomware, but potentially state sponsored hacking events that start to blur the line between computer hacking and physical military intervention, and that this continues to create more tension between the United States and China and Russia, and to the point that maybe some of it boils over into military level conflict. So that's my concern. I don't, that's definitely not ending on a lighter note, right? Which is the goal of this segment, but that's my real concern. I mean, we saw with the pipeline hacking this year. And I think a message was sent that the ransomware crews need to really back off, but there's just so much opportunity to make money with attacks like that, where you have companies that are going to have to pay, and they've underinvested in technology, and then plus the reports that you keep seeing come out with like 0-day vulnerabilities, and software has gotten so complex. I was listening to a podcast from KuppingerCole, actually. So KC Live has a fantastic podcast that I recommend people check out. And Martin was talking about the amount of lines of code that go into a traditional software product, and it's almost impossible nowadays not to have bugs inherent in complex software programs. So I think 0-day vulnerabilities continue to be found, which means that every organization is vulnerable. And anyway, I don't want to harp on that negative prediction, but I don't see anything that's going to turn the tide in the other direction. To me, it just seems like the problem is getting worse, and at some point, the government's going to have to step in and say, we can't fight this with ones and zeros.
Okay, so yeah, I don't know if I necessarily have a more positive one. I feel like it's a little bit of a Debbie Downer situation, but I think we're going to see a couple things. I think we'll continue to see zero trust be sort of like the marketing term du jour for organizations shifting that. We've already seen that kind of this year kind of take hold. I think just based on the slow moving trains that a lot of organizations is 2022 will really be when, okay, now we've got room in the budget to kind of address some of those things for this hybrid environment of people working from home, remote. I think VPN will still be around, but I think its days are starting to get numbered. And I think we'll start to see more of that zero trust edge kind of process be in place. I think I'm going to see a lot more organizations struggle internally if they have not invested in just the basics of identity management. Jim, you and I, the work that we do, we see a lot of kind of immature organizations just by the nature of what we work on. And, they're using basic processes. Things are manual, and they've really fallen behind where they should be at this stage of the game, where they don't have, dedicated IGA tool sets. They're kind of doing things in Lotus Notes or other things, right? We joked several months ago, around, hey, if you're using Lotus Notes successfully and you're really happy with that as an IAM platform, please come on the show and tell me I'm wrong. 0 people have come back to me on that one, just as an update, if you want to look back on that. But I think, just from a maturity standpoint, if you're not doing the basic blocking and tackling and identity perspective, even just the basics of identity governance, automated onboarding, offboarding just for Active Directory, even basic access reviews, basic privilege access management, that means more than just I have this vault and I put passwords in there, but they don't rotate. There's no discovery of those things. You're not doing anything around like session management. You don't have MFA in place or even adaptive or conditional rules in place. Like that's the basics. And I think it's so hard to catch up if you don't keep up with it. So what we typically see, at least from my perspective, is this hurry up and wait, and then you stop investing, and all of a sudden what used to be considered great was, you're barely cutting it. And you're having to spend a lot of money doing any number of things, manual, support for things, fraud issues that might come up because you don't have the appropriate behavior analytics. So unfortunately, I think I'll continue to see a lot of those organizations that just haven't invested internally in identity. And I think hopefully the positive spin on that will be that they took this last year and realized, oh, crap, we really need to get our identity hats on and kind of fix some of these systemic issues that might be present in an organization. So that's going to be my prediction. John, do you want to weigh in? Do you think are we negative Nancy's here or Debbie Downers for people who are familiar with Saturday Night Live?
Well, don't leave it to me to be the optimistic one. That's not a good idea.
You're the voice of reason and sanity.
I mean, there will continue to be attacks. I'm sure ransomware is not going to go away. It makes the criminals money. Fraud's not going to go away. All these things mutate and change. I mean, the real world analogs are really good examples, things like viruses themselves. These things change. We have to kind of retool and adapt our own processes to deal with it. So, and those that do a better job at that are going to be more resilient against different kinds of attacks.
So, Jeff, what I was going to add, based on what you're talking about with organizations that are laggards, that are closer to the starting line than they are to the finish line, it reminds me of that one meme where you can see a lion and these two antelopes are talking. The one antelope says to the other, "I don't have to be faster than a lion. I just have to be faster than you."
Yeah, that's the old how do you run away from a bear, right? You don't have to be the fastest one. Just got to be faster than your friends.
Yeah, it's just got to be faster than your friend. And I mean, how that applies to what we're talking about is there's so many of the fraudsters out there that are looking for easy pickings. A lot of them are not computer scientists who can come up with the 0 day. They're people who can download scripts and go on the dark web and download tools and work their way into your environment and then run Mimikatz and own your Active Directory. But once they own your Active Directory, they own you. You pretty much are in a position where you can't conduct business. And so, I mean, you have to be faster than your friend, or you have to be faster than the other antelope. You don't want to be the total laggard that is just sitting prey.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So somewhat, I don't feel like we were successful in ending on a lighter note, but I think it was interesting from a thought-provoking perspective to say, okay, what are your thoughts going into 2022? Like, what do you see happening, right? Is this the year passwords will die again for the 10th year in a row? Who knows, right? I'm optimistic. I think there's a place for it, but we'll see. Before we wrap up here, any final thoughts, John, as we kind of anything we've talked about today, whether it's on the prediction side for 2022 or the fraud reduction kind of components that we talked about before? What are some final things you want to leave with us for 2021? No pressure.
Well, I guess I would say, just thinking back on fraud reduction, there has been a massive evolution of fraud techniques, and what I find valuable about the solutions that are out there in the fraud reduction space is they evolve as well. And I think there's hope in that, just like there is for identity management in general. Yes, there are organizations out there that don't have as mature infrastructures or processes in place as they should, but there are those of us who are part of this community that are willing to help and provide assistance and guidance in that. So I think that taking a look at the kinds of work that you're doing with the podcast, and others in industry here, I think that maybe that should give us a way to end positively.
I think John just called us heroes, and I'm going to take it. I think that's what I'm going to glean from that. So, but yeah, I think you're totally right, John. Right? There's a bunch of IAM heroes that are running around. If you're listening to this, you're probably an IAM hero for your organization, or you're providing IOM heroics for some other organization, whatever that looks like. So, well done, John. I like that. Jim, how about yourself? Final thoughts.
Yeah, silver lining here is that for folks who are looking for a career where they can make a difference and make an excellent living, identity access management or information security, fantastic field. I encourage anyone who's interested to tap into us as resources, tap into the community. I'd love to see more universities put together degree programs focused on information security and identity and access management. It's a field where right now there's more jobs than there are people to fill those jobs. So I mean, maybe overall in the economy, that is where we are across all industries. But it seems like this problem, good economy or bad, uh, identity and access management and information security are, white hot fields that you could build a great career in.
Plus, you could be one of the weirdos that actually picked identity and then just fall into it by accident. Like my theory is that most people did anyway. But yeah, it's a great community, tons of great resources out there, and tons of great people who are totally interested in sharing the knowledge. Right, a lot of this is not competitive secret sauce where people are not willing to share it. So definitely encourage people who are interested, check it out. Tons of resources. We've had some folks on in the past that have been, giving back to the community as well. I think of people like Andrew and David and things like that, where there's just tons of resources out there that's community driven. So there we go. We brought it back to the positivity side of things. So that's good. We're going to go ahead and end it there. I think this has been a great year for us, and we certainly hope to see the continued growth and listenership that we have all around the world, and hope people have a great holiday season here over the next few weeks while we take a break. So again, just a reminder, we will take a break here for a few weeks for podcasting, but we are going to continue theoretically some of the live streams. So keep an eye on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. That's where we'll announce it, and we'll be streaming on YouTube here and there over the holiday break. So come join us there for some quick conversations. So with that, we'll go ahead and leave it. Thank you so much, John. Thank you so much, Jim. And we will talk with everyone in 2022.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.